This isn't my story, but rather one told to me by a friend a couple of years ago. The event she related to me took place somewhere in the northwestern United States. I'm from England, and my US geography isn't great, so please forgive any vagueness in regards to the location. Also, before beginning the story proper, I should probably provide a few details about the legend of the Wendigo, just in case anyone is unfamiliar. The Wendigo is a demonic half-human monster that appears in the mythology of some Algonquian peoples. It's thought to be born when a human resorts to cannibalism and has three key traits that really depends on what mythology you're reading. 1. They eat human flesh. 2. They move extremely quickly. And 3. They can imitate voices in order to lure in prey. My friend, who for the sake of privacy I'll call Gemma, was about 13 or 14 at the time. She was in a car headed towards California with her father, her stepmother, and 2 younger brothers. At some point relatively early on in the journey, her stepmom says that a couple of miles ahead there's meant to be a really beautiful rock face covered in vines that she'd read about, and that it might be a nice idea for them to stretch their legs and go look for it. Everyone agrees, not least because both of Gemma's brothers really needed to pee. So, a couple of miles down the road, they park up in front of these woods, through which the rock face is supposed to be. My friend's dad says that he'll supervise the 2 boys, while Gemma and her stepmom go ahead, and they'll catch up with them in a few minutes. So Gemma and her stepmom head off into the woods. One important detail to remember is that it had rained very recently, and so the woodland floor was very muddy. Nothing particularly eventful happened while the pair were looking for the rock face. Long story short, they never found it, as the stepmom had only a vague idea of where exactly it might be. However, as the woods were set on top of a sort of cliff, they did get a really nice view of the river below when they emerged out to the other side. Glad to have been able to at least stretch their legs after however many hours in a car, the 2 of them headed back into the woods. Gemma's dad and her brothers had not caught up with them like they said they would, so Gemma's stepmom was concerned that they might have gotten lost. The woods weren't that big, as far as they could tell, but it was still a possibility. Plus, the ground, as previously mentioned, was sodden with rain, so the mud could have slowed them down. So Gemma and her stepmom were walking back through the woods, and as they reached what was roughly the middle of town, from somewhere just up ahead of them, they heard the dad, who yells, "Where are you guys? We can't find you." The 2 women roll their eyes and one of them yells back, something like, "We're over here, just head to the left," and then they carry on walking. They are most of the way back to the car when they hear the dad's voice again. Only, this time, it's from some distance behind them. Like the 2 of them had completely passed him without seeing one another. He yells the same thing again. "Where are you guys? We can't find you." Mildly irritated, the 2 women yell back, "Look, we're just gonna head to the car, we'll see you soon." When Gemma and her stepmom get back to the car, they find that the dad and the 2 boys are set inside waiting for them. Climbing inside, Gemma's stepmom asks the kids, "Did you have fun?" In reply to which the dad chuckles, "We didn't bother in the end, it was too muddy and the kids were complaining. After they'd done their business, we just went back to the car." Gemma just laughed in reply and didn't think anything of it until a few miles down the road. Glancing at her brother's shoes, she saw that, unlike her own thoroughly muddy ones, theirs were clean. She asked her stepmom to check her dad's, and his were the same. It was highly unlikely that they would have been able to hear the dad calling to them from the middle of the woods if he was still by the car. And even if this had been the case, then how could he have been able to overtake them before beating them back to the car with enough time left to thoroughly clean their shoes? The voice they had heard was definitely his, and even if a stranger had somehow been able to imitate him, they hadn't heard or seen another soul while they were there in those woods. Gemma will never know for sure who or what it was that she heard that day, but being familiar with the legend of the Wendigo, she says that she's forever glad the 2 of them never came face to face. before I begin, I'll tell you this. This does not involve an attack. There was no Ouija board or any of that spooky stuff. And when I was 4, it started, but when I was 7, it stopped. I'm 13 now. So, when I was a little kid, and up until a year back, we had a dog. She was a medium-sized lab beagle mix, and she had a tendency to snort a little bit. Her name was Haley. I was an imaginative kid, and I still am, and I had and have insomnia. Now, one night I was lying awake, trying to get to sleep, when this silhouette came up next to my bed. It was the same size as Haley, so I just sort of glanced at it. Now the thing about Haley is that she would come into my room and lay down next to my bed, and when she got to her spot she'd do that little spinny thing that dogs do before lying down, but this shadow just stood there. I obviously didn't think this was odd, because I didn't notice Haley's behavior back then. It stayed there for about 15 minutes, with me just staring at it, and then it left. I didn't hear Haley's nails though, which I only remember when I look back on it. And I finally fell asleep at about 1 in the morning. About 2 nights from that, the thing I thought was Haley came back. This time I got nervous though. Not a little bit either, like really, really nervous. It stood there again, and I stared at it. I've never been that still in my life. I'm not even joking. It stayed for a little longer, and then left again, and I eventually fell asleep. I didn't tell Mom and Dad about this. A week later, in my own bed again, I heard some kind of noise from the hallway, like a kind of sweeping noise. Still lying down, I looked into the hallway, and I saw a black thing, totally covered in long, matted hair. This was bad, because my dog has short fur and was yellow, but this thing was either black or brown. I couldn't even see its legs. Its hair was trailing onto the floor, and I couldn't see any eyes. The only thing without hair was some kind of weird pseudo-trunk thing, only it didn't have the open part at the end. It looked like it had been amputated. I hid under the blanket with only my eyes peeking out, and I saw this thing move into my doorway. It got halfway in the door and just stared straight ahead at my wall. I heard some sort of weird snorting noise, but it was coming from whatever was in the doorway, and Haley had been in the living room all night. I heard it sniffing, and something that sounded like a quiet sob. The thing was crying. I sat there and just stared at it, and it felt like it was staring back at me. I wanted to call for my mom, but I couldn't say a word, and I could barely move. The thing sounded so sad, and then it did what still scares me breathless. It moved right next to my bed. It was at that moment that my 4-year-old mind clicked, and I realized that the thing that had been standing by my bed all those nights was not my dog. I watched it move right up next to the bed, and it turned its head to look right at me. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't. I could hardly breathe. I couldn't talk, I couldn't blink. I could see whatever it was shiver a bit. Then its breath hitched, and it began sobbing again. It sounded like some other kid, a little boy now that I think about it. The thing just looked at me, and I think it stood there the whole damn night. And I got absolutely no sleep. The same thing kept happening for years, and I never told a soul. I learned to hide completely under my blanket, and to not move, no matter how much I panicked. It stopped a few months before my 8th birthday. I've told my best friend about this last year, and I only told my parents after a huge panic attack. I had developed anxiety not too long after. Maybe a coincidence. I've called this thing Sniffles, because there's really nothing else I can call it. And whenever I hear something crying, I still get nervous, and I tried to avoid anything with long fur or a trunk. And from there on out, I've always slept with a nightlight. Hopefully the light will keep it away.
First off, a separator is one of the Philippines' most frightening creatures. It hides in the form of a woman. These women often strike on small towns and houses in the woods. They often feast on children after abducting them and killing their mothers, but they also kill other people. But Before they start their killing frenzy, they have to separate their upper body from their lower body. They do this in the comfort of their own home or dwelling, somewhere where they feel safe, where they think no one can find them, like abandoned buildings or caves. Its lower body can even stand on its own, and if you're close enough, you can see some gruesome things. Both halves of the body are connected, and they can feel when the other is being disturbed. Now, this brings me to my sighting. This happened during the nighttime. I get up to get a glass of water. It was almost 6 in the morning, so I was still tired. I quickly got my water and began to drink. I went to the stairs to look out the window, and that's when I saw the most bizarre and terrifying thing I've ever seen. There was something crawling on the ground below, something skin-colored. I looked closely, trying to focus on it, and it looked like someone's lower half. I nearly dropped my glass of water. I kept staring at the thing as it crawled. Soon I began to get creeped out, so I backed away from the window. I didn't know what to do, and I was afraid to tell anyone. My cousins and I don't really get along a lot of the time, and they like to tease me, and if they caught wind of me seeing something like this, all they would do was ridicule me and embarrass me. So I kept it to myself, no matter how much I wanted to tell someone. Later that night, when it was getting dark again, I went back to the kitchen to see if I could see this thing still. When I got to the window, I looked down, and it was still there, no longer moving. For a moment, I didn't feel as scared anymore, just weirded out. But a few seconds later, I heard this gasping or panting sound. I bent down and hid under the windowsill. After a few moments, my curiosity got the better of me, and I stood back up, looking out the window again. There was now a woman standing outside. She had long black nails, and her hair was white with streaks of red, like she used blood to dye her hair. Though I could barely see her eyes, I saw enough. They were dark as pitch, and she had this odd grin on her face. This wide grin revealed all of her teeth. They looked to be grinded down to a point. Suddenly, this wicked primal scream came from her. Her mouth didn't move an inch, but the shriek still filled the house. It was both painful and horrifying. Immediately, I ducked back down, thinking that she had noticed me. I was scared for my life and shaking at that point. I had heard stories of the separator before, and I knew what they were weak against. Trembling and fearing for my life, I crawled over to the table and I grabbed some salt. As I crawled back over to the window, the screaming stopped. After a few moments, I gathered the courage to stand up again, and she was gone. All that remained was that lower half of someone's body. Now, I forget to mention that there was no glass in these windows, and that might be part of the reason I was so freaked out, because if she did see me and wanted to, she could come to the window and pull me out, or crawl through herself. So immediately I poured the salt onto the lower half. I then ducked back down below the window, because if that was a separator, it would know that I poured salt on it, and it would be back soon. For the longest time I sat there, still and silent, listening to what may come outside the window, but I heard nothing. It seemed like an hour or two passed before I finally stood up and looked out the window again. But this time, there was nothing there, and the lower half was gone. Still terrified, I ran up to my room and tried to go to sleep, though I didn't. The next morning, I built up some courage and I ran outside to where the window was, and there on the ground where I saw the lower half, there is this mark like something had been burned there, and I swear it wasn't there before. We don't burn things there at that part of the house. This feeling of relief and fear filled me. This sight told me two things. One, I stopped and maybe even killed the separator that was stalking our yard. And two, there are things out there that we don't understand. Deadly, dreadful, terrible things. Because a terrifying piece of my folklore was standing right outside my window. I don't know what it would have done if I never poured the salt on it, and I just hope it's gone for good. I've always considered myself a nature lover. I've been hunting since I was 9 with my father. He's taught me everything I know, from hunting tricks to guns. Telling this story continues to give me chills up my spine. and I try to keep it out of my head. But I feel I need to share my experience and warn anyone in New Hampshire of what I saw. I'm 19 now, but when I was 16, my parents usually let me hunt alone since I could drive. I drove a 2006 Chevy Silverado. I usually bring my Winchester rifle with enough ammo to bring down at least a deer. It had to have been around 12 noon. I parked my truck, gathered my things together, and I set off into the New Hampshire White Mountains. Nothing about that day at the time seemed wrong, and I definitely didn't expect anything of what I experienced that day. I trailed up maybe 3 hours into the woods, in woods that I know really well. By maybe 3 or 4 p.m. I was tracking a deer. I didn't know the size, I just followed fresh tracks for maybe 2 miles. By the time the sun began to set, maybe 5 or 6, that's when things became off. I never hunt in the night, and I don't hunt in the mornings, so I decided to head back to my truck. This is the part I wish I kept moving, so that I might have never seen this. But as I was maybe less than an hour from the trail, I stopped at a rock and took a drink, and I placed my rifle next to me. As I took a small swig of my drink, I remember hearing leaves being moved around. The sound was coming from up in front of me, up a hillside covered by heavy brush. I thought I got lucky, so I raised my rifle quickly, keeping the crosshairs in the direction of the noise. There was also a clearing there, and I expected to take a clean shot if it ever moved into that open space. But as whatever it was moved into view, my heart dropped, and what I remember seeing was nothing but something from the depths of hell. I stood there with my eyes wide open and my heart racing as I stared at a large creature standing on all fours. It seemed to have gray-reddish fur. Its snout was long, and I remember seeing long teeth protruding from between the lips. In less than a moment, it noticed me standing there, watching it. It turned its head and stared me dead in the eyes, and almost immediately, I began to tear up. This was like nothing I've ever seen before. I totally forgot I had a gun, and once it took its first step to me, it snarled, showing each of its teeth. Facing a horror I never thought I'd see in my life, I dropped my gun, and I ran. As I ran, I'm sure I heard this thing give chase, and I never ran so fast in my life. My heart was racing, and I didn't run out of breath for a second. It must have been the adrenaline, because I honestly thought I was going to die. I remember running up a hill and feeling a paw or something try to scratch up my ankle. I was whimpering and screaming the moment it touched me. I know this story sounds crazy, but I've never been so scared. I heard something growl behind me, and I could hear leaves crunching under something's heavy weight. I never turned around, being so mentally afraid and paranoid of being face to face with this thing. Once I reached the trail, still crying and eyes flooding, I remember I couldn't see much, but once I reached the parking lot and dove into my car, nearly hitting myself with the door, I fumbled my keys trying to start my truck, screaming at myself to hurry. I think there were 2 other cars in the parking lot at that time, but no other people. I remember slamming on the gas before I even put my seatbelt on, and I didn't flip on the headlights until I was gone. I flew down the dirt road that connects to the main road, not seeing anyone until I made it to the center of my small town of Jackson. I ran 2 red lights, and I pulled into my driveway, running to my house, leaving the keys in my car. I even left the door open, so paranoid that something followed me home. When I ran in all panicked, my parents were of course dead confused, but at the very least, they could see that I was terrified. I was still tearing up, and I wanted them to lock all the doors and to keep them closed. I was such a nervous wreck that my parents had to force me down onto the sofa. I'm pretty sure it took at least 20 more minutes after that just to calm me down. Once I told them everything that I saw, they said that it was probably a bear or some sort of dog, but the image of this thing has been seared into my mind. I know better than to think it was a bear or dog. What I saw, I'll never unsee. Mock me if you want, but I slept in my parents' bedroom, and I kept a pistol on the nightstand just in case. The doors remained locked. I probably freaked my parents out, and I didn't sleep at all that night. When morning finally came, my father said that he and his buddies would go where I saw this creature and get my stuff, and maybe even see if they could find it and hunt it down. But I begged them not to go. I followed him to his truck and begged him, but he wouldn't listen. They left and found my things. They said they found tracks and my footprints. They said that the tracks looked dog-like, and they were mishmashed with mine, all the way up to that hill where it nearly grabbed me. They said my bag looked like something went through it and chewed all the things up. But my rifle was still there, unscathed. Yet they never saw or heard what I saw. I still remember the sounds that thing made, and it's been 3 years later. To this day, I refuse to hunt up there. In fact, as I'm writing this, there have been sightings of what I saw up close. I'm sorry I couldn't put more detail into what I saw, but it happened so fast. I'm sharing this to warn people. I'm begging you to be careful when you go into the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I've seen pictures of the tracks of this creature, and I can guarantee you it's more than a dog. I refuse to go back. Even now when I tell this story, I have chills up and down me, and I feel so paranoid. I hope I never see the White Mountain Hound again. I've had an urge to share this story for a long while. The following events that you will hear happened up until about 2 months ago. I live in the country in Middle Tennessee, and I've grown up in the woods all my life, and I walk through the woods around my home all the time. Let me describe to you the layout of the property. This will help with the story. My house is set in a small flat area that has a few trees around it. Behind it about 50 yards is the shop and dog pen. Then to the left of that, there is a big open field, and behind that field is a thick, dense forest. One day a long time ago, when I was really young, my dad and I were up late, and I was with him when he decided to get a late-night snack, so we went down to the kitchen. As soon as we got down there, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and my dad pushed me back. I looked out of the window of the kitchen, and I saw these 2 glowing blood-red eyes staring in at us. My dad picks up the first thing within reach, which happened to be a baseball, and he chucked it through the window and hit this thing. He hurried me back up to bed, where it took me almost the rest of the night to fall asleep. But right when I began to nod off, I was awoken by a faint scratch on my window. Frozen in fear, I didn't dare move, but I did glance to a place where the curtain didn't cover the window, and by God, I saw those same eyes. This scratching at my window has been going on for years now. Today I am 15, and I've grown some, and I've actually gotten used to the sound somewhat, until recently. It was an average Friday night, and I had a daily task of putting the dog away, something I'm not fond of. Our dog is a grown Saint Bernard and holds his own against the other dogs. I grabbed my shoes into light and a gun out of habit, and I headed out to grab the dog. I called and whistled for him, but he never showed up. So I go and make my way to the pen, a walk I always hated. After a few seconds of shining light on the ground as I walked, I started to see this glistening on the ground, like moisture. I knelt down and looked closer, and it looked like blood. As I continue on, there seems to be more and more of it. That is, until something else glints in my flashlight's beam. It's the same red eyes that I've been seeing. Those same red eyes from long ago, when my dad and I went to get his late-night snack. But now I could see these eyes were attached to an insanely muscular yet skinny figure. This creature must have been about 8 feet tall, with pale gray skin. Its head was rounded and dome-shaped, with sharp fangs hanging out of the corners of its mouth. Its hands were long black claws. They ended in sharp points. At that moment, in sheer panic, I brought my gun up and without aiming I fired twice. I highly doubt I hit the thing. But the moment I fired, the thing ran right past me, making a terrible hissing screech. It ran through the field, screeching all the way, until it disappeared into the woods. The thing had run so fast through the field that I couldn't keep my light on it. Needless to say, I couldn't find my dog. The next morning, I got up with my dad to go investigate, and I go to where I encountered this creature, and I see what looks like burn marks where it was standing and leading off into the field. But we never found my dog. Better yet, the tracks we found in the field where I saw this thing match the tracks that we found later under my window. I am 18 years old and I live in Arizona. I'm a full-blooded Cherokee Indian, so I'm no stranger to stories about these skinwalkers. My grandfather always warned me about them, saying they'd love to get a hold of me and my friends. I'm very open-minded when it comes to things like this, but I must say, even this may be hard to believe, but I swear, it really happened. I was upstairs in my room, and I woke up to my phone going off. It was my friend Kinsey. She had texted me asking if I wanted to sneak out to go to the park with her. I of course said no, because it was only 6 o'clock in the morning. A few minutes later she said, "Well, I guess you're going to miss out on all the fun with Chris and Logan." My heart skipped a beat when I read this, because Chris and Logan are the hottest guys in school. So foolishly I text her back, saying that I'll be outside in 20. She lives down the road from me. After I got dressed, I sprayed on my favorite perfume and put on my favorite lip gloss, just in case. I opened my window and she was there waiting for me. Chris and Logan were with her. I called down, "Hey, how are you guys?" They all say, "Good," and Chris asked if I needed help getting down. I said, "Sure." I laughed and blushed. I shimmied myself out onto the roof. He said, "Come on, I promise I'll catch you." I hate heights, so I pretty much had to force myself to jump. But when I did, I felt Chris's hands grasp me. He put me down, and we made our way to the park. On the way, both of the guys were staring at me, and I personally didn't care because they were attractive. Keep in mind, I am very developed for my age, and Kinsey is pretty skinny. I felt kind of bad, because Kinsey was kind of forgotten about. So I decided to ask her what time it was. She said it was 6:18. We arrived around 6:30, and I was pretty excited. There are woods next to the park, and we went into them. Needless to say, we began to get a little feisty. Chris and I began to kiss, when we suddenly heard a sort of moan. It sounded like a cry of pain, but it wasn't human. It sounded demonic, to be honest. We became still and quiet, waiting for another sound. Then this cackle came out of nowhere, and we heard heavy, loud footsteps approaching us fast. There was no pattern. They were just jumbled and discorded. At this point, the sun was beginning to shine down. We saw this dog. It was massive. It just looked at us. But there was something off about this dog. I kept looking at it and noticed that its huge eyes weren't like a dog's sweet brown eyes. They looked more complex, like a human's. I could even see the whites of them. It stared at each of us, one after the other, over and over. It was sneering at us. So me, being an animal lover, I said to it, "Hey, big guy, It interrupted me with the most evil, ear-piercing howl. It sounded like a screaming woman with static, in deep growls at the same time. It sent chills to my core and all over my body. I looked behind me and Chris's face was as white as snow. The dog then ran away, and we all watched it, noticing that it didn't have a tail at all. Not like it was amputated, more like it was never there at all. And then the smell hit. I can't even begin to describe what it smelled like. All I can say is it smelled of death. Kinsey threw up because it was so putrid, and we all decided it was time to go. We noped the hell out of there and began running back to the park. As we were running, we heard that ear-piercing howl again. It was so freaking loud. I started to cry. There was no way of knowing if it was following us, if it wanted to hurt us. Luckily, we made it back to Kinsey's house after 10 minutes of sprinting. I threw up in her yard from running so hard. Chris walked me back to my house, and again, lucky for me, my mom had gone to work and never checked to see if I was still in my room. Later on, I told my grandpa about this experience, and he said that it must have been a skinwalker. He blessed me and my friends and gave us all silver. Skinwalkers hate silver, and we never spoke of it again. I was 16 at the time, and Chris and I are now living together. That thing, it's still out there, and I just know some poor souls are going to have the same thing happen to them. I just pray that that thing goes back to hell, where it belongs. This happened to me about 1 year ago, which would make me 16 at the time. It was early in the winter, and I would often go out for walks and just enjoy the cold nights. Winter is my favorite season after all, and I love the cold. This night, however, I didn't feel like walking very much, so I just decided I wanted to sit down in the backyard for a while and look up at the stars. I pulled on my warmest jacket I could find, and I said to my parents that I was just going out back, and I wouldn't be out for long. God, I didn't know how right I was. I opened the sliding glass door and made my way over to our picnic table to lie down. Normally the ground would be more comfortable, but the grass was wet that night. I lay down on the table and tried my best to get as comfortable as you can while laying on a wooden table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Now, I consider myself mildly paranoid and I have anxiety issues, so feeling watched wasn't uncommon for me. But this time it was different. Much, much different. I looked around for only a brief moment, and that's when I saw it, and I froze in fear. I remember it in very vivid detail. It was standing upright between a bush and a tree in my neighbor's backyard, only about 35 feet away. Its eyes were nothing but black holes, and its skin was a dark, grayish, nasty green. The skin around its mouth was torn away, revealing strangely sharp teeth and dark gums. Yet it was standing perfectly still. But it wasn't the kind of steel a tree trunk would have. It was still like a predator before it strikes. My first thought was to not make any sudden movements, trying my best to hold back tears so I could still see the dang thing. I got up slowly from the table and I lowered myself to the ground, not once breaking my vision from it. I backed away really slow until I felt like I was close enough to the house that I could bolt. And I charged as fast as I possibly could, opening the door and slamming it shut in an instant. I could not manage to sleep at all that night. It was the only time in my life I've had such an instinctive fear that if I didn't run, I would die. I told myself over and over my mind was just playing tricks on me, and that it was just a stump or a tree or log propped up against something and it looked funny. But I checked the next morning and there was nothing there in the spot that it was standing. There was nothing that I could have mistaken it for. It was completely gone, with no trace of anything being there at all. I still have a hard time going out at night now, and I have very thick curtains on my windows to the backyard. But before I go, just a quick word of advice. If you're planning on walking around at night, at the very least, bring a friend or a family member. Trust me, you won't regret it. My name is Sasha, and I'm from a small town in New Hampshire called Chesterfield. I don't currently reside there, but that's where this story takes place. This happened when I was about 15. I was hanging out with some friends in a town across the Connecticut River in Vermont called Brattleboro. Once it got late, everyone went home, and I was stuck in town without a way home. Chesterfield was maybe 7 or 8 miles away. It was summer, so I figured, screw it, I'll just walk. Once you leave Brattleboro, it's a straight shot up Route 9 to Chesterfield. To get to my house, I had to take a left onto this road that cuts through a field where the Chesterfield Inn sits. That road always creeped me out, even in the daytime. It just never felt right, like you were being watched. But, like it or not, I had to go down that road. About halfway in, I noticed what looked like a man standing on the other side of the guardrail. He appeared to be looking at the inn off in the distance. I didn't really think too much of it, because people would walk this road all the time. But it was about 2 or 3 in the morning, and most of the people who lived on this street were fairly old, so it was really odd to see someone out this late. But again, I tried to brush it off, and I kept walking. It was very bright out thanks to the full moon, so vision wasn't an issue. When I finally get about 20 feet away from this man, I started to notice how odd he looked. He was pitch black, completely black like a shadow, and he was very tall, at least 7 feet, and he didn't have any distinguishing facial features, as if he didn't have a mouth or nose at all. And he appeared to have long hair blowing about, but there was no wind. He was very thin yet muscular at the same time. As I was taking this all in, I was moving closer as well. I was maybe 12 feet away from this thing now, without him noticing me. He just kept staring at the inn. Kind of freaked out, I just decided to get his attention and get it over with. So I said, "Hello." He turned, looking at me, revealing his eyes that shined bright yellow, not like the reflected traits of cats' or dogs' eyes. It was more like they were lit up with electricity. This scared the crap out of me. What he did next was probably the most disturbing and confusing thing of all. I'll do my best to describe what I saw. He turned away from the guardrail, leapt forward, and disappeared. He didn't simply vanish like smoke. He more walked through an invisible door. I couldn't speak. I just ran until I couldn't anymore, being creeped out the whole rest of the way. Needless to say, I did not sleep much that night, and to this day I have no idea what this thing was. I believe what I saw was a demon. That was 15 years ago, and every day since then I still wonder, what was the creature I saw?
Back in the summer of this year, 2016, and before I stopped going for my nightly walks and jogs, I was on my regular route and nearing my block. Keep in mind, it was about 10 at night, or somewhere around that, so the only light I had were porch lights and street lamps. Now, I don't take any hallucinogens, nor am I making this up, and I wasn't the only one who saw this thing. Another key point for this is the fact that I live in Florida, and this is where this happened. Not only this, but I have always been prone to paranormal or creature sightings. Anyway, on to the story. Like I said, I was out at about 10 at night, and I was walking alone before running into two of my friends. Let's call them Jane and Emma. They had just been to a party and were walking back to Emma's place for a sleepover, and I agreed to walk them over there, since they seemed a little on edge about being out so late. Sometime later, we were about 5 blocks from Emma's house, and we were just laughing and gossiping like teenage girls typically do, when, out of nowhere, I got this chill down my spine. The only way I can explain it was the feeling you might get if you're being stalked. I told my friends, and they reported the same thing. Like an idiot, I begged them to walk me back to my house, since we were a block away at the time. They agreed, and to this day I regret begging them that. Maybe then, none of this would have happened. Then again, we were all stupid for being out so late in the first place. Anyway, we reached my driveway and we were talking and whatnot, when all of a sudden, we heard a trash bin fall in the distance. We all jumped. Jane pointed her flashlight down the street, expecting a raccoon or something. Then, again, I'm not sure what she was expecting to see. And that's when we saw something standing in the middle of the road. This thing's limbs were far too long for its body, and I'm not sure if it had fur or not. Most of its body was pitch black in appearance, but some of it was exposed bone and vertebrae. Its eyes had no pupils whatsoever, and please don't get me started on its tail. After at least 2 minutes of a stare down between us and this thing, it finally began to scramble towards us like a freaking spider. We all screamed, and we ran into my house. Since then, I have seen this creature multiple times, and my friends refuse to talk about it. I've sketched it a few times, but I still don't know what exactly it was. A few of my friends have dubbed it a wendigo, while others call it a skinwalker. I'm still not sure what to call it myself. If anyone else has seen something similar, please share your story. I'm 32 years old, and all of this happened when I was a child. It was always in the middle of the night. In my parents' house, there was about a 20 feet long hallway, and my room was at the very end of it. My bed was against the wall, and I was facing the doorway. I had a nightlight in my room, and I left my bedroom door open at night, because I didn't want these things to come into my room. You see, when I was 5 and over the next several years, I saw creatures that I'm not sure my innocent, childlike mind could conjure up. I would see them in the middle of the night, and I know when I saw them I wasn't asleep or in some sort of sleep paralysis. I've experienced sleep paralysis, but this was different, as I could move. I'll try to give details as to what they look like, at least the ones I can easily remember. I can't remember the exact order of their appearances. The first I will tell you about is what I call the tar creature. It was standing in the hallway. I couldn't really tell what the creature was. It probably stood 5 feet tall, and it had its arms stretched out at its sides, and it looked as if globs of thick oil or tar were dripping off of it. And even worse, it looked enraged as it stared at me. It didn't move at all, it just stood there, angrily. There was another that appeared to be a shadow that danced along the walls, and when I saw it, I sat up for a minute and watched it, before jumping out of bed and running to my parents' room in sheer terror. One night, when I had walked into my parents' room to sleep with them, there was a small man sitting on their bed. He was a dwarf in size. I remember being confused when I walked in, wondering, who is that? I just tried to lay down between my parents and ignore it. It was hard to ignore when this thing poked its sharp fingernail into my back and said, "I want to talk to you." But I continued to pretend it wasn't there. I've even seen 2 creatures in the reflection of my parents' mirror, but they're impossible to explain. One night when I walked into my parents' room again, yes, I was very terrified all the time of these things, and so I slept with them a lot. I laid down in their bed, and as I looked towards the doorway, these 2 things came walking in. I'm shivering just talking about it. I could hear their footsteps on my parents' wood floor. They were humanoid, but their heads were really strange. They were round on top, and when it reached their neck, it was like the bottom of a lampshade, if that makes any sense. I couldn't make out any of their facial features. They were like shadow people. They walked in, and I watched them as they tapped on my mother's shoulder, and they called her Mom, but it sounded like me. Then I heard one of them say, "She isn't waking up." And then I heard them walk out. The next day my mom said she had heard and felt something in the middle of the night, but she wasn't able to open her eyes. One night I woke up, and I could hear the obvious sound of someone talking, but it sounded so inhuman, like 2 aliens talking to one another. It was garbled and terrifying. There are many other things that I saw, but unfortunately I cannot remember all of them. I used to cry and pray to God that I would not see these things anymore. To this very day, I have absolutely no idea what these things were, or where they came from. I was always too afraid to confront them. But I still want to know, and I'll probably always wonder. It was like living in a haunted house, but instead of the usual human-looking ghosts, I was haunted by monsters. I can't be thankful enough that I no longer see them, and I hope it stays that way.